Why would the enemy of heaven seek out a corpse? Not a throne, not a kingdom, but a lifeless body buried in silence. Among all the mysteries scattered across Scripture, there's one that most readers overlook, hidden in a single line from the book of Jude. It speaks of a strange and silent conflict, the Archangel Michael contending with Lucifer over the body of Moses. That's it. No explanation, no backstory, no follow-up. Just a confrontation lost to time. But why? Why would Lucifer, the fallen morning star who once stood before the throne of God, descend into a valley to claim the remains of an old prophet? What power did that body hold? What threat did Moses still pose, even in death? And more importantly, why did heaven intervene? Michael, heaven's appointed warrior, didn't come with an army. He didn't raise a sword. He didn't even argue. He simply said, "The Lord rebuke you." And with that one sentence, Lucifer backed away. This wasn't just about Moses. It was about ownership, about legacy, about spiritual jurisdiction. Because the question isn't just what Lucifer wanted. It's what God was protecting. Could it be that Moses' body was more than dust? That it was preserved not only by God's hand, but for a divine purpose still unfolding? And if God would send Michael to defend the lifeless body of a man who had failed, doubted, and disobeyed, then what might he do for you? In this investigation, we're pulling back the veil on one of Scripture's most shadowed moments. A conflict between light and darkness, between legacy and destruction. A mystery the church rarely mentions, but one that may carry more weight than we've ever realized. This is the untold story of the battle for Moses' body. And now, you're about to see it like never before. Moses, the man who never truly belonged to earth. Before we understand why Moses' body mattered to both heaven and hell, we need to understand the man himself. Because Moses was no ordinary prophet. He didn't just receive the law, he became the law. He didn't just witness miracles. He was the instrument through which miracles were delivered. He was born during genocide, raised in the palace of the very empire that tried to erase his people, then exiled into the wilderness, only to return as a mouthpiece of divine judgment. This was a man who met God in flame, stood before Pharaoh in defiance, and walked into the sea before it split. But even with all that, Moses was never fully at home, not in Egypt, not in the desert, not even among his own people. He was always caught between two worlds, chosen, yet flawed, called, yet misunderstood. And in a way, that sense of exile never ended, not even in death. When his final day came, Moses didn't pass away surrounded by family or followers. There was no procession, no tomb, no nation gathered to mourn. Instead, Scripture tells us something deeply unusual. And the Lord buried him, and no one knows where his grave is. Deuteronomy 34. God himself performed the burial, alone, in secret. Why? It wasn't sentiment. It wasn't ritual. It was protection. Because the story of Moses wasn't over. Though he had led Israel to the edge of the promised land, he was forbidden from entering it. Not because he wasn't worthy, but because his journey served a different purpose. Moses represented the law, the boundaries, the holiness, the impossible standard that pointed toward something greater. He stood atop Mount Nebo, overlooking a land he could see, but not touch. And in that moment, he became more than a prophet. He became a symbol, a man who had spoken face to face with God, a man whose skin had glowed with borrowed glory, a man whose hands had held stone tablets etched by the finger of the Almighty. If anyone had touched heaven while still on earth, it was Moses. And that's precisely why he was dangerous to the kingdom of darkness. Because Moses was proof that flawed men could still carry divine fire. That human failure didn't disqualify someone from eternal purpose. And that intimacy with God was still possible, even after disobedience. Lucifer, the accuser, knew this. He had watched Moses his entire life. From the Nile to Sinai, from the burning bush to the forbidden mountain. And when Moses breathed his last, Lucifer wasn't ready to let go. Not of the message, not of the symbol, not of the body. Because even in death, Moses still belonged to someone else. Not to dust, not to memory, but to God. This is why heaven moved. Why Michael descended. Why silence fell on that unnamed valley in Moab. Because one man's grave had become the front line of a spiritual war. Moses wasn't just a man. He was a message. And that message, if left unguarded, could shake kingdoms, bend narratives, and silence accusation. That's why his body had to be hidden, not from men, but from forces that understood what it still represented. Moses never truly belonged to earth, and perhaps that was the point. The silent war between heaven and hell. The battle over Moses' body wasn't fought with fire. No swords clashed. No thunder roared from the sky. There were no legions, no witnesses. Only two figures stood in the invisible center of a spiritual fault line, Lucifer and Michael. But make no mistake, this was war. And it was about more than a body. It was about authority. Lucifer didn't arrive weeping. He came with intent, calculated, cold, and entitled. He had a case to make. Moses had disobeyed. He struck the rock. He failed. To Lucifer, that meant one thing: jurisdiction. To him, Moses had broken the law, and he was the accuser. In his twisted reasoning, Moses belonged to the grave. And the grave, he believed, belonged to him. But that's the mistake darkness always makes. Confusing technicality with truth. Mistaking divine mercy for weakness. Treating covenant like a contract. Lucifer wanted the body not because of what it was, but because of what it represented. If he could take the body, he could weaponize the memory, turn Israel's reverence into obsession, create shrines, stir idolatry, corrupt legacy into spectacle. He could parade the body through the camp and say, "This is your prophet, and I own him now." And that's exactly why Michael came. Not to argue, not to prove Moses was innocent, because he wasn't, not to justify his legacy, because it didn't need justifying. Michael came to make something very clear. "The Lord rebuke you." 7 words. That's all. But behind them stood the full weight of heaven's authority. This wasn't a debate between equals. Michael didn't engage in legal back and forth. He didn't invoke Moses' record. He invoked God's sovereignty. And Lucifer flinched, not because of who Michael was, but because of who sent him. This war wasn't about muscle. It wasn't even about morality. It was about who had the right to claim what was already claimed. Because heaven had already sealed Moses. God had already buried him. His story was still in motion. And hell had no permission to interfere. There's something profound in this. Lucifer's rebellion didn't begin with violence. It began with a challenge to order. He wanted to rewrite boundaries, to redefine who deserved what. And this moment, at Moses' grave, was just another attempt to unseat divine structure. Michael didn't just block him physically. He upheld the original architecture of spiritual law, that only God determines ownership, that failure doesn't void covenant, that authority flows downward, from the throne, not from the grave. This war, silent as it was, shook realms, because it reminded all creation that even in death, God does not abandon his own. But there's a chilling reality here, too. Lucifer didn't come to attack Moses in life. He came when Moses was gone, when the prophet could no longer speak, when no one could defend him, when legacy, not presence, was on the line. It's a tactic that hasn't changed. Today he still shows up at graves, not literal ones, but symbolic. The graves of your past, of your regrets, of your old mistakes and forgotten callings. He waits until you're silent, until your influence fades, and then he tries to rewrite your story. That's what he tried with Moses. But heaven wouldn't let him. Because there are some things darkness cannot touch, some people it cannot claim, some stories it cannot finish. Even if the world forgets your name, heaven remembers your worth. Even if hell demands evidence, God simply declares, "This one is mine." And when that declaration is made, all of hell has to step back. Because even in silence, heaven still speaks louder. Why Lucifer wanted Moses' body so badly. Lucifer doesn't waste his time. He doesn't show up for just any soul. He didn't fight for Joseph's bones. He didn't contest the whirlwind that carried Elijah. He didn't stalk the grave of King David or the prophets of old. But Moses? He came in person. That alone should make us ask, what made Moses so different? Why would the most cunning, ancient, and strategic mind in all of rebellion risk confrontation over a dead man? The answer lies not in the flesh of Moses, but in what that body symbolized. Because Moses wasn't just a prophet. He was a spiritual landmark. 1. Moses was the foundation of the law. Moses received the 10 Commandments, dictated the Torah, and became the visible conduit of divine order on earth. To Lucifer, this meant power. Because if he could distort Moses' legacy, he could distort the law. And if he could distort the law, he could weaponize religion. He could turn obedience into oppression. He could take a message meant to point toward freedom and use it to enslave. The law had become flesh, and that flesh had died. If Lucifer could claim it, he could corrupt it, not by destroying the tablets, but by dragging the messenger into disgrace. A corrupted Moses would taint the covenant. A tainted covenant would confuse generations. And confusion? That's Lucifer's greatest currency. 2. Moses' body had touched divine glory. This wasn't just a corpse. This was the man who stood on Mount Sinai and saw the glory of God with his own eyes, whose face radiated so brightly with holy light that Israel had to look away. 4 days afterward, Moses wore a veil, not because he was hiding shame, but because he had absorbed glory. Now imagine, from Lucifer's twisted perspective, what if that body still held a trace of that glory? Lucifer, the original hoarder of divine light, would have been obsessed with reclaiming it, not to honor it, but to pervert it. He has always sought to mimic the things of God, to steal them, invert them, and use them for destruction, to take something once sacred and make it unrecognizable. If he could get his hands on a body that had once radiated the presence of God, he could desecrate it, humiliate it, make a mockery of everything it represented. That's not just evil, that's personal. 3. Moses was destined to return. This is the part Lucifer feared the most. Because he understood patterns in prophecy, he knew that Moses' story wasn't finished. Centuries after his death, Moses would stand on the Mount of Transfiguration, beside Elijah and Jesus, in full form, not as a spirit, but resurrected presence. And if Lucifer could claim the body before that happened, if he could desecrate or corrupt it, he might disrupt the future itself, not just interrupt a moment, but distort a message that was meant to echo across time, that the law and the prophets must one day stand beside grace. If Moses was the embodiment of the law, and Christ the embodiment of grace, then that moment on the mountain, Moses beside Jesus, was prophecy fulfilled. Lucifer wanted to break that alignment, because he knows something most people forget. If he can twist the vessels, he can cloud the message. For Lucifer wanted to undermine redemption itself. Moses failed. He killed a man. He disobeyed God. He struck the rock. And yet, God still called him friend, still spoke to him, still buried him. Lucifer couldn't accept that. To the accuser, failure must equal disqualification. Forgiveness is foreign. Grace is offensive. If Moses could sin and still be used, still be honored, still be praised, then Lucifer's entire theology of condemnation collapses. So he came to disprove it. By claiming the body, he could say, "See, even your heroes belong to death. Even your chosen fail." He wanted to turn a redeemed story into a cautionary tale. But heaven said no. Lucifer didn't want the body of Moses because of what it was, but because of what it meant. It was a symbol of unfinished destiny, of divine glory that once touched human flesh, of a man who failed but wasn't forsaken. And to Lucifer, nothing is more dangerous than that. Because if redemption is possible after failure, if covenant still holds after mistakes, then his lies lose power. And that's a war he cannot afford to lose. What this battle reveals about God's view of your life, body, and legacy. Most people think God is only concerned with the soul, that once we die, the body is discarded, just dust returning to dust. But this battle, this celestial confrontation between Michael and Lucifer, tells a very different story. Because if the body didn't matter, God wouldn't have buried Moses. And heaven certainly wouldn't have dispatched its top-ranking warrior to guard a grave. So what does that tell us? It tells us that your body, your story, and your legacy matter to God more than we realize. 1. Your body is not disposable to heaven. God could have allowed Moses' body to decompose naturally. He could have let it fade into the wilderness like any other man's. But he didn't. Instead, he personally buried it. And then he hid it. Why? Because in God's eyes, the body is not a trivial shell. It's part of the design, part of the testimony, part of the covenant. Yes, the soul is eternal, but so is God's claim over your physical being. The same body that sinned is the body God forgives. The same hands that failed are the hands he still uses. Lucifer knew that. That's why he came for the flesh, not the soul. Because if he could defile what was once holy, he could taint the narrative of redemption. But heaven said, no. 2. Your past doesn't cancel God's claim. Let's not forget, Moses messed up. Big time. He murdered a man. He doubted God. He disobeyed direct instructions. In earthly courts, he would have been disqualified. But in the courts of heaven, he was still chosen, still used, still honored. And when he died, God still said, "This one is mine." Lucifer came prepared to argue, to list Moses' failures, to build a legal case. But Michael didn't argue. He didn't say, "Yes, but look at all the good Moses did." He said just one thing: "The Lord rebuke you." In other words, this isn't about merit. This is about belonging. If you are marked by God, then not even your worst moment can erase his ownership. That truth doesn't just apply to Moses. It applies to you. 3. Heaven protects what you leave behind. There's something haunting about this part of the story. Moses wasn't there. He didn't see Michael fight. He didn't hear Lucifer accuse. He didn't witness the defense of his own grave. And yet, heaven acted in his absence. That should shake us in the best way, because it means you don't have to be present for God to protect your legacy. You don't have to be alive for God to guard the fruit of your obedience. Long after you're gone, the prayers you prayed, the people you mentored, the words you spoke, the faith you modeled, heaven still watches over them. Lucifer may come to twist it, corrupt it, confuse it, but God sends angels to hold the line. That's not poetic. That's prophetic. It means your life echoes beyond your lifespan, and those echoes are not left unattended. For the enemy always tries to claim what he's already lost. Lucifer had no legal right to Moses, but he came anyway. He had already lost, but he still tried. That's how darkness works. Even after God has forgiven you, even after you've surrendered, even after your story has been redeemed, the enemy still shows up to accuse, to steal, to rewrite, not because he can win, but because he hopes you'll forget who you belong to. And when that moment comes, you don't need to argue. You don't need to defend your past. You just need to echo Michael's words. The Lord rebuke you. Because authority doesn't lie in your perfection. It lies in your position under God's ownership. This battle over Moses' body wasn't about bones. It was about a deeper reality, that when God lays claim to a person, he claims everything. The body, the failures, the influence, the future. And if he would send an archangel to protect a grave, don't you think he'll move heaven and earth to defend you, even now? You are not forgotten. You are not abandoned. And even the parts of your story you've buried, he still guards them. The message of Moses' body, why this mystery still matters today. We tend to think of biblical mysteries as ancient history, stories locked in the pages of Scripture, far removed from modern life. But the battle over Moses' body? That's not just a footnote in Jude. It's a mirror, reflecting a spiritual truth that still echoes through time. Your story doesn't end when you're finished, and your value doesn't vanish when you're broken. Moses was gone. His leadership had ended. His mission was complete. And yet, heaven and hell still wrestled over what he left behind. That alone should tell us something. 1. What you carry is bigger than you. Moses wasn't just a man. He was a message, a walking testimony of how God uses the flawed, the exiled, the unqualified. And that message didn't die with him. Lucifer knew that. That's why he came. Because even a silent grave can preach. Even the memory of obedience can shake darkness. Even a fallen leader can still point to redemption. That's what the enemy fears. Not just your life, but your legacy. Not just what you say, but what your life continues to say after you're gone. So he comes to steal it, to twist it, to make sure that when people remember you, they remember your failure, not your faith. But Moses' body says otherwise. 2. Failure isn't final in God's eyes. Moses made mistakes, serious ones. He doubted God at the burning bush. He murdered a man in Egypt. He struck the rock in anger and disqualified himself from entering the promised land. And yet, God still spoke with him. God still called him friend. God still buried him with his own hands. And not only that, Moses returned centuries later, standing beside Jesus at the Mount of Transfiguration. If that doesn't rewrite the definition of redemption, what does? Moses' body, preserved and protected, declares a message hell hates. That failure is not disqualification. That calling can survive disobedience. That God's ownership remains, even when our record is messy. That's why Lucifer wanted the body. He couldn't stop Moses in life. But maybe, just maybe, he could silence the message in death. He failed. 3. You are fought over, even when you don't see it. Moses wasn't aware of the battle. He didn't see Michael arrive. He didn't hear Lucifer's accusations. And yet, it happened. In the silence. In the unseen. Which begs the question, what battles are happening over you right now that you can't see? What graveyards in your past is the enemy trying to dig up? What legacy of yours is he quietly trying to distort? What influence have you left behind that hell is hoping to claim? You may never know the full extent, but God does. And if he sent Michael for Moses, he will send help for you, because what belongs to him is never abandoned. 4. The mystery still matters because you are still in the story. This wasn't just about Moses. This wasn't just a theological anomaly. This was God planting a truth in Scripture, hidden, almost invisible, but powerful. I will fight for those who are mine, even when they're gone, even when they've failed, even when no one else remembers. You may not be leading a nation like Moses. You may not be writing commandments, but you are still part of the same covenant. And the enemy still wants to silence your impact, steal your name, erase your example. But he can't, because heaven remembers what hell wants to forget. Because your legacy, when surrendered to God, is not just protected, it's preserved for future glory. Moses didn't just rest in peace. He rested under protection. And the same is true for every child of God. So yes, this mystery matters, because it isn't just a tale about angels and prophets. It's a revelation that even after death, even after failure, even after silence, God still fights for you. And if that truth doesn't change how you see your own story, then maybe you haven't heard the last chapter yet. Maybe you've never thought of your life in these terms before. Maybe to you, it's just a series of small decisions, some good, some bad, playing out in a quiet corner of the world. But the story of Moses' body reminds us that no life surrendered to God is ever forgotten. Not even in death, not even in failure, not even when the world moves on. Because behind the scenes, beyond the veil of the visible, you are still being fought for. And not because you're perfect, not because you earned it, but because you belong. The same God who sent Michael to guard a grave is the same God who walks with you now. The same God who preserved Moses for glory is the same God who is preserving your legacy, even when you can't see it. So if the enemy whispers that you've gone too far, that your past is too dark, that your calling has expired, that your story is over, remember this. Lucifer came for Moses' body, but he left empty-handed. Because what God claims, God keeps. You don't have to fight alone. You don't even have to be present for God to defend your name. Your obedience matters. Your failures don't cancel your purpose. And your life, your body, your impact, your very dust is sacred to him. Let that truth settle in. Because when you feel invisible, heaven still sees. When you feel disqualified, God still calls. And when you feel forgotten, angels still stand watch. So here's the invitation. Take inventory of what you've buried. Your dreams, your calling, your sense of worth. The parts of you the enemy tried to steal, distort, or silence. And ask yourself, if God would guard a grave, what might he still want to resurrect in me? If this story stirred something in your spirit, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Rewatch it. Let it remind you that spiritual battles are still being fought, quietly, fiercely, invisibly, all around your life. And perhaps, most of all, remember Moses, not because of what he built, not because of where he failed, but because even in the silence of a hidden grave, his story was still sacred. This is more than a mystery. It's a message. And now, you've seen it like never before. Until next time, stay watchful, stay grounded, and stay unshakably his.